thank you again to everyone for joining us today as we discuss expanding the impact of your public affairs team without adding headcount. Now, as you likely know, this webinar today is inspired by a report that we put out at Quorum about a week or so ago, where we surveyed over 250 public affairs professionals on what their 2023 looks like, the biggest challenges they're facing, the biggest areas of focus, where they might be transitioning resources, all of those things. And with that, we came with some key takeaways, but also some key challenges. So we want to use this webinar to just give a quick recap of the report, but then really dive into those challenges and some of the ways that teams can address them. So as we dive in, just for those who are not familiar with Quorum, Quorum is a public affairs software that helps you work smarter and move faster. We help you map, track, change, and report across the policy landscape with solutions for stakeholder engagement, grassroots advocacy, legislative tracking, and most recently, our two new additions, impact management and communications. So our agenda today, like I said, we're going to give some quick report highlights, then move into a couple of key buckets of areas of focus based on the report, including returning to in-person, managing the impact focus, the increased focus on state legislatures, the increased focus on advocate education, hiring and upskilling your team, a quick preview on how tech like Quorum can help solve some of these problems, and then time for Q&A. You're welcome to put questions throughout the session in the chat or the Q&A box, and we will get to them as we go through as well, since we're talking about a few different topics today. So first, before we dive in, I would like to introduce our speakers. Today, we have two wonderful speakers. First, we have Brian Rubenstein, the president of the Rubenstein Impact Group, which helps organizations drive greater engagement from their audiences and help run successful campaigns. Previously, Brian led digital strategy at the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And second, we have Cicely Simpson, the founder and CEO of Summit Public Affairs, as well as a career coach for public affairs professionals. Previously, Cicely held roles at the National Restaurant Association and Dunkin' Brands. So thank you both for joining us today. So our biggest focus of this report that we uncovered is the greatest challenges that government affairs programs are facing. Survey respondents were able to select their top 3 challenges. And what was really interesting to us was this number 1 challenge, that we are understaffed. But conversely, we are underfunded was down here at the bottom. So we heard from a lot of people, we're at full capacity for staff, but we still have too much on our plate. And so what we want to talk about today is how to address that challenge. How do you get more out of the resources you already have? If you're not hiring a new role or you're not able to expand the scope of your team, how can you get a bigger bang for your buck? Are there things that you're doing that you don't necessarily have to be doing that maybe we can trim some of that extra work? Are there ways that you can use the same resources for multiple efforts and campaigns? So those kind of ways to increase efficiency, increase impact, while dealing with staffing limitations is where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. And the other trends we saw throughout the report really can show the factors that are contributing to this challenge. So 37% say that one of their top 3 challenges is there's too much legislative and regulatory action to track. And 83% say state level lobbying and advocacy will be more critical for their organization in the year ahead. And there's obviously way more legislation at the state level on a regular year than compared to federal, but we're only seeing that increase. And so how teams adapt to that increase there is a big focus. 87% say in-person meetings are a top channel of communication, and that a lot of their virtual efforts are being either pushed away or now supplemental to in-person. Now, obviously, going back in person can be a bigger time commitment than some of those virtual offerings. So how do we make the most of that? And then 45% say advocate education is a top focus of their grassroots programs. So how do we make sure, one, those education programs are making the most of it, and figuring out what's actually really needed? Because it can be a big lift and a big time opportunity to build out that educational programming. So let's start with returning to in-person engagement and a conversation with our 2 speakers here. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can see everyone's face full screen here. And so Brian and Cicely, wondering if you can both talk just a little bit about what you're seeing. Brian on the advocacy side, Cicely from the kind of lobbying government affairs side. what the return to in-person over the last couple of months has looked like and what's having an impact. Cicely, maybe we can start with you on the lobbying side with Capitol Hill back open for business.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Teresa. And Brian, good to see you. Great to be here with everybody today. It is an interesting question as folks not only, here in DC are grappling with it, but as I have clients who now are dealing also with a bevy of state legislation coming their way, they're grappling with that as well. How do you show up in the states? How do you show up on the Hill? What part is virtual? What part is in person? I don't know that there's a right way or wrong way to do that other than realizing, to your point, Teresa, and the report says this, the dynamic has changed. We've shifted. We've gone from all virtual to kind of virtual hybrid to now really in person, driving a lot more of the engagement. But it's funny, I see this on the state level, but I'm definitely seeing it here in DC. Some offices will say to you, I don't want to see you. Just call me or get on the phone or Zoom. So some are very vocal, probably more so on the federal level than I'm seeing on the state level about how they prefer that engagement. Is it in person? Is it Zoom? Is it a little bit of both? I'm definitely hearing that more here in DC, where the state folks are like, no, I need to see you. You got to be there. Let's have that interaction. But Brian, I'll turn it over to you if you're hearing a different perspective.
No, very much the same. I will say, while the offices might not be as excited about volunteers being back roaming the halls of the Capitol, from a grassroots perspective, it's a great thing that those buildings are now open again. And what I'm seeing with a lot of organizations is, for one, 2023, for many, they are definitely bringing people back to the Hill, but they're actually doing it a little bit differently. We've been advising some folks to do it a little bit differently. Instead of bringing 200 or 300 or more people to the Hill, as some did, which from a staffing perspective, Teresa, to go to your part about they're understaffed from the survey results, it's far easier to manage a group of 50 volunteers than 250 volunteers in DC. And so what we're seeing is clients bringing smaller groups to DC, then actually combining that with separate virtual lobby days from home. So moving away from this hybrid where you're trying to do it all at once, but having a definitive in-person day. And then if you have particular targets that you're not going to reach in your in-person, actually working with your volunteers to schedule those Zoom meetings with the lawmakers. So that way you are going to be able to hit all the critical pieces you need to. And you can actually get more volunteers involved, because certainly you're able to, a lot more people can be available to do these virtual meetings. They can take 3 or 4 days off to go to DC.
I'm also curious. So one of the reasons that folks are feeling especially inundated with is not only the return to in-person, but the fact there's so many new legislators to meet that, like, we understand that face-to-face is best, and that's probably not going to change. But the number of people that are needed to meet this year is higher than in other years. Given that that's probably, people are probably not going to not introduce themselves to those organizations and those new folks in leadership, new freshman legislators, what are the ways, both from a government affairs and an advocacy side, that folks can make the most of that opportunity so that they're using their time with the best impact for those new legislator interactions?
Brian, I'll defer to you first.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, it's an opportunity. So a new lawmaker and their staff, especially their district staff, they're going to be welcoming people in the door. They want to meet the community. Certainly they met a lot of them through the campaign, but they realized they had sort of a small circle to get them elected. And so it's an incredible opportunity for your volunteers, if you have those volunteers at the state level and those districts, to just say, you know what, I'm going to schedule an appointment when that lawmaker is back in the district. I don't need to go to DC. The other thing we remind people is just how important district staff is. If you can go meet with that district director, that is just as good as going to meet with that lawmaker in DC, maybe even a little bit better. And so the fact that they're new means they're going to be more welcoming than maybe some of those long established lawmakers that don't have to worry about getting reelected or such. So it's really a great moment to seize and to leverage those local volunteers you have to go in and do that.
I couldn't agree more. I think the focus definitely has gone from meeting the 75 new House members, per se in DC to, how are you inviting folks into maybe your clubs or your restaurants or your stores or your operations, your warehouses? Do that back home in the district. Do that back where the lawmakers are. I think Brian's exactly right. There's so much power in leveraging the lawmakers and their staffs when they're at home that I think tend to be in the past. It's you got to go meet them in the Capitol. You got to go to their swearing in days. You got to go to the inauguration days. And it's like, no, the 5 seconds you get there is an hour tour back home in the district. So Brian, I couldn't agree more. I think there's so much power in leveraging the district staff and members when they're back home versus, a balance of that in DC.
And I love just one more thing. I love what you said about having the lawmakers come to you. It doesn't mean you always have to go to them. Plan a tour of a restaurant or a manufacturing facility, anything that has a lot of employees. Invite the lawmakers to come to you, to be part of them. There's a media opportunity there for them. They get to meet more voters and constituents. So I think that's a brilliant idea to think about it the other way as well.
I like how you mentioned this media opportunity and positioning it for them, that it's not just them doing a favor to come to you, but there's that selling the benefit to them of, these are all the ways we're going to make this worth your time to come to us. Another kind of tangent I wanted to discuss here is the staffing point. She talked about the district staff being a valuable asset, but when is it okay? In what instances do you actually need that member's time versus talking to their staff? So if you're going to go in person, if you get 30 minutes with the staff versus 5 minutes with the member, when is that worthwhile versus really taking the time to meet the member themselves?
So I think we're going to agree on this one. I'll let you take this one first.
Are we going to agree on this one? Okay. I was going to say, I actually, and Brian, feel free to agree or disagree on this. I like to actually leverage them both. I prefer to start with staff because my approach with getting to know new members or even existing members is I want that connection to the staff member. And yes, there is a point in time to meet the member or the lawmaker, but I really want that connection with staff so that when I meet the lawmaker, I already know the staff member. I already have credibility with the staff. So then the member, is kind of the added bonus, but I really tend to focus on staff to the point where I will go meet new staffers and even existing staffers. Like Teresa said, I'll have a conversation about March Madness with them. And then I'll say, oh, hey, you know what? I got something for you and your boss. I'll follow up with you. But now they remember me as the person who's picking an SEC team in the March Madness, not that I'm, just coming in, doing my talking points, got to talk to the boss and I'm back out the door. So I tend to really drive connection with staff and then go to the member and use those strategically, depending on the issue and the client versus just one or the other. But Brian, tell me if I'm right or wrong on that one.
100% right. The ego for a volunteer comes from meeting with the member. That's the photo op and such. But at the end of the day, if they can meet with that staff person, now they've got a contact in that office. And for a lot of the organizations I work with, we train those volunteers. Here's the follow-up you're going to do after that meeting. And now you have a staff person's email address. You have a relationship. You're not going to email the member and get responses, but you can email that staff person and follow up with that staff person. Say, hey, you said you guys were going to endorse this bill or support this bill. We haven't seen your name on the list yet. So I love going after the staff. And look, getting a staff, I work with a lot of health organizations. Getting a staff person to cry from a patient story is just as effective, if not more effective, than getting that member of Congress to tear up. So we're aligned on this one.
That's a great point.
And I think when we're thinking about time management and making an impact, one thing that the staff, building a relationship with the staff saves time for is not necessarily the time it takes to go to the Hill or go to the State House, but in that response time is if having that relationship means that your emails get responded to in a day instead of a week. Or when you do ask for that meeting with the member, you get a reply instead of having to bump the email 3 times. That the actual act of meeting in person might still be pretty time consuming and a high lift. But if it makes those in-between steps more manageable and more expedient, then that has an impact there. As 2 folks who probably travel quite a bit, before we move to the next section, I'm curious, Jess, what's your travel tip of 2023 for the folks who are flying crisscross to state houses? Any tips there just before we move on?
Brian?
If you're within 4.5 hours, drive. That's my tip. You have the car there, you have the flexibility there. Don't even worry about flying at this point. If you can get there within half a day.
You know what? I didn't think about that. Why didn't I think about that? I live on an airplane since I split my time between DC and Nashville. So I guess my travel tip, now I'm going to drive. That's my travel tip for the day is I'm going to take Brian's advice and drive. But I think the other tip I would just add on there is For those of us who used to crisscross in the country, travel's not what it used to be. It is not a smooth experience anymore. And I've seen so many other lobbyists in the airport. It's like, you're going to miss your meeting? Yeah, me too. Okay. So I would say fly in the day before is probably my tip, because there's a lot of us sitting in the airport going, yeah, probably going to miss that one because, travel delays or whatever. So just realize travel hasn't quite returned to what it used to be.
Now, we did get a question related to this topic that I do want to touch on before we move on, although I said we were jumping to the next section. So someone talked about how they have experienced where actually when they go to, in this case, the governor being their target audience, when they go to the governor first, it actually creates more animosity with the staff because they feel like they were skipped and gone around. And so the question that they have is, how do you find the right staffer to start with? Which is the best person to reach out to?
It's a good one. Go ahead, Brian.
No, you go ahead. You got the inside, all that inside work on the Hill.
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Because that can go both ways. It can be both, beneficial that you go to the governor, but some staff may be, that's not cool. So I totally get the question. I think the answer I would give there is, even if and I do this with lawmakers all the time, I do it with governors, even when I go to RJ or DJ meetings, I'm like, hey, great to meet you. Who's a staff member I should follow up with? Who should I talk to? I immediately say, hey, buddy, I got you. You're not the person I'm talking to. Who's the staff member I need to go connect with? And then I immediately go to the staffer, or to Brian's point earlier on follow-up and Teresa's point, as soon as a meeting is over, I'll follow up with the staffer and say, great to see you and your boss. But I always say, great to see you and your boss. So I'm very intentional about the language I use in connecting with those staffers, even if I know the boss first. But how to find the right staffer? If there's somebody with them, I always follow up with that person. If there's someone there physically, in the meeting with them or at a reception or something. If not, then I try to reach out to their ledge staff or, before going to a chief of staff. But the right person usually, or if the staff's not there, ask the boss, hey, who on your staff should I follow up with? And the governor will tell you who to follow up with. That's been my experience.
Our experience has been, just ask. They're happy to, this isn't a secret. They don't try to keep this information secret. It's in their best interest to direct you to the right person and not have you floating around the office. So just don't be afraid to ask. Know who you're looking for and tell them, and they'll almost always get you to that person you need.
Yeah, good point.
Awesome. So making a transition to our second trend that is causing this overload at the staff level within public affairs teams is states. Now, it's no big surprise that this report showed people are transitioning their focus to the states. There's tons of things contributing to this. Gridlock at the federal level means states are left there. Supreme Court has sent a lot of issues back to the states. We had one person in the report who referred to a trend of coerced federalism, where the federal government is passing these huge spending bills, which forces the issue on the states because they have to decide how this money is going to be spent and managed. We're seeing new trends of what one person called, or increased trends of what one person called beg and borrow, of states really copying each other and seeing patterns. So there's we'll start with the ledge tracking and the lobbying side with Cicely, but then Brian will come to you on teams who have to have a new focus on states, how they can spin that up. So Cicely, from the get-go, before you can even engage on state bills, you have to know what they are. What are the ways that you see the best teams actually decide how to keep up and then prioritize the bills that are spreading everywhere?
Yeah, so no surprise, I'm going to say tracking, because to your point, you have to have awareness of what's out there. And I actually just had somebody say to me the other day, oh, I feel like I'm missing something, Cicely. How do I know? How do I keep up? And that was a conversation I had with someone who was doing state work. The tracking becomes really, really important, because that is where you see the trends. And then the tracking and the software like Quorum, and look, I'm a big Quorum fan. I tracked these guys down within the first 6 months that they were in business back in 2015, because technology has changed the game in public affairs. How you leverage technology is going to be how you manage the tsunami of legislation coming. Because once you have the tracking, and I'm a big fan of Quorum's tracking for all of my clients, now that I am in the client-based business, then you put the strategy around. So they have the tracking in the ecosystem that then allows you to build the strategy. I'm doing this for a client right now who doesn't have a GR person. And they're looking at me going, how do we keep track of all this? So it's the tracking that then creates the spreadsheet. So I can go to my client and say, here are the trends. Here are the states where it's pending. To Teresa's point, there are some states that have copied each other. The language is the exact same. So now it's not 10 strategies, it's one strategy because all the language matches each other. It's just a matter of tailoring it to that individual state. But you can't see those trends and put together that strategy if you don't have the tracking and ecosystem to support it. Because once you have that, and then the strategy internally, let's be honest, there's an internal strategy for your internal stakeholders. There's an external strategy for the lawmakers. You really have to have the technology and the tracking system to be able to bring both of those together, the dashboards, all the pieces that complete that. So Teresa, I'm walking clients through that right now, and that's where we're starting is the tracking and using Quorum to say, what is it? Where is it? And in my case, for one of my clients, I have franchisees. Where are the franchisees located in these states? There are grassroots. How are we getting them activated in this, the tracking? How are we getting them engaged and involved? And that's the ecosystem I'm talking about creating internally as well as externally. It starts with the awareness and the tracking for sure.
Awesome. And so for some of these teams, since they're not adding staff, responding to every bill is not necessarily possible. How do you think about, like, this is a bill that, like, I recognize it's on my issue, but it's just not going to make my efforts this year?
There's an impact analysis, and Brian, you may agree or disagree with this, but I did it when I was corporate. I did it when I was a trade association. I do it now with my clients. There's an impact analysis you have to go through. I believe both by state, likelihood of success, who is a legislator, what's going on. I have a bill in Rhode Island right now. Well, the Senate president signed on as a co-sponsor. That's a good sign. That one may actually go somewhere and may actually have some teeth to it and some momentum to it. So you have to really kind of do the impact analysis to know, are there some states that are less important? Are there some states you need to lean into? If you have a presence in a state that's larger than another, again, all that is part of your impact analysis, that legislative landscape analysis you need to do as these bills come up. So there's definitely a prioritization. Even once you start the tracking and you have kind of the list of, okay, here's what we're tackling, then you've got to go in and prioritize what you're seeing, how you're seeing it. I'm going to channel my inner Brian here for a second and say, where can your staff handle it? Where can your grassroots advocates handle it? How do you divide and conquer, so to speak, in terms of where you need to have a presence? So there are multiple ways to do that, but you kind of got to have that core piece of the equation first. Brian, how did I do? Did I track you okay? Am I
sounded just like me.
See, this is what happens when you're around great people on a webinar, right? I'm totally getting the osmosis.
Awesome. So the last question I'll direct. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I love that impact analysis. And the one other column I would add to that is, where is the legislative need versus the legislative want? And so there are some bills that that can have an impact that they're going to get done in the back room, no matter what's happening on the outside. These are technical bills, they're complex, they're going to get done in the back room. And there are other bills where grassroots really can have an impact. And so as you're talking to your volunteers, your members, your donors, you can't overwhelm them with 25 different bills that you're going to be pursuing this year, because they can't follow that. You really want to be much more focused. You really think about, what is that volunteer member donor experience going to be, and try to focus them in on those bills and those issues where they truly can have an impact. And you know what? If something's getting done in the back rooms and you think it's about to pass, then maybe we always tell our folks, you know what? All right, give your folks a chance to engage at the very end, and then you can all claim credit for it and celebrate it after it gets signed by the governor.
Great point. Great point.
I like that. And then, so a question for both of you, then I think we can transition more to the grassroots focus, is there are some issues that for teams that simply did not engage at the state level before that now are moving there. So for a team who is maybe starting from scratch on their state engagement, they don't have built-in relationships within their in-house team necessarily. And that's obviously not going to get spun up to be the highest impact function in the short period of time without potentially outside resources. But if that is the case for someone who's really spinning that up, what are the lowest hanging fruits or the first things that you think someone who's typically focusing at the federal level and needs to make that transition should do?
Brian?
I'll take a shot first. So first thing, really important, a state legislature is not a mini Congress. It's not the same thing, just in smaller form. It is a different animal in a number of different ways, some which are going to really help you and some which are going to make your life a little bit more challenging. So that's first and foremost. Second is every state believes they are different and unique. And I will say every state does have its own nuances, but what I like to remind people is, except for Nebraska, they all follow the same legislative process. And so they're not quite, I used to have someone who worked for me like to call people a special snowflake. They all think they're a very special snowflake. They're not quite as special individually as they think they are. And then the third thing I'll add, this is certainly could be a very long list, a webinar in itself, but a third thing I'll add is that it's much easier to make a big impact from a grassroots perspective, to make a big impact at the state level than it is at the federal level. A federal level member of Congress's office, yeah, you might drive 50 phone calls, but you're still getting drowned out by someone else. You drive 50 phone calls into a state lawmaker's office, you've got their attention. And so the things that you're used to doing that maybe haven't had a big impact can really have a significant impact at the state level. And I'll tell you, one or two great volunteers down at the Capitol for a day or two, they can cause a lot of good damage for you. They can really make sure your issue is elevated, that your voices are heard. So it doesn't take a huge volume of people like it might at the federal level to really make a difference.
And I think in a similar vein to that, in the same way that these public affairs teams have more on their plate with the same people, the same is true of state legislatures. They don't have more members than they did 4 years ago to manage this volume. They don't have more staff, as we know.
If they have any staff.
Or any staff.
Yeah.
As we know, many of them are part-time. Sessions didn't get longer to manage all of these bills. And so that ability to enter the conversation and move it is probably more feasible, because these legislators don't have time to get up to speed on all of the issues of every single one of these bills. So they might look to folks in this industry more often to build up that credibility and knowledge.
So many places to go with that one. Was that a question?
A statement more. But great. So I'm going to jump to our next section. So our next trend that we saw in the report that Brian will spend a little more time with you here on the advocacy side is the biggest focus within advocacy this year that folks listed as a challenge was advocate education. It was a higher focus than activation and a higher than acquisition. And so first, I'd love just your take on that. Why do you think there's this increased focus on education in this year?
So it was really interesting when I read that, because I'm actually a believer, a little contrarian to that. When I think about advocate education, so you think about this at two levels. You have your very high level volunteers who are doing your meetings with lawmakers. And then you sort of have your bottom level of your pyramid, sort of your digital volunteers, your larger numbers. And for that bottom level, my belief is when it comes to education, they only need to know enough about your issue to compel them to take the action you want them to take. They do not need to be issue experts. They don't need to know the path the bill is taken or all the details of the bill, because at the end of the day, that's also what your lobbyists are for. Where your volunteers are useful is taking this 500-page bill and personalizing it in a 2-minute story or a 30-second story. And so I'm actually a believer in only minimal advocate education at that bottom level. Even at that higher level volunteer, again, they want to talk a little bit more knowledgeably, but their value is still that personal story and helping take this issue and turning it into how it really impacts that community, that lawmaker's community, that lawmaker's district, right? I always refer to people as sort of that street level impact. And so maybe education and training are used interchangeably. I'm a huge fan of volunteer training and offering great training opportunities. But I would say if your big focus is advocate education, that might be a little bit of resource that you could put somewhere else in your portfolio.
I think that training is a good point. And I'm curious what level of training do you see as important for understanding the actual legislative process, who the members are, how advocacy works, and if there are resources or tools that you have seen folks use to not necessarily reinvent the wheel when they're setting out these programs of how Congress works or things like that.
Yeah, as far as how Congress works, I don't think you have to get too much past Schoolhouse Rock for a volunteer for them to realize how a bill becomes a law. The most important thing that we like to educate volunteers and members and donors on is why the repetitive nature of the ask, that there are going to be multiple steps in this process. We are going to need them to take seemingly the same action multiple times. But it really is important that they take it that third, fourth, or even fifth time, because that means the bill is at a different part in the process. And so just helping them realize, hey, we're going to come back to you with this. And then using your tools like Quorum, like Phone to Action, that really offers you a lot of different ways for your volunteers to engage. And so look, for volunteers, I always try to remind people this needs to be fun for them too. And so asking them to send a message to a lawmaker every week is going to get boring for them. So use those built-in tools like calling the lawmaker, tweeting at the lawmaker, the letter to the editor, surveys and polls. Use some of these other tools that these platforms provide to keep your volunteers engaged in between these really important legislative asks.
And so some things that we see folks do also with Quorum is one, I know we have folks who are from the trade associations themselves on these calls, but if you are a member of a trade association, using their resources on your advocate website, things like that, so you aren't having to rewrite those talking points or things like that. The other step, which setting it up can be a bigger lift, but than not doing it, but that it has down funnel impacts, is a lot of Quorum folks using gamification for their advocate education. This means assigning points to different actions that then accumulate, and you can offer prizes or levels or rewards, different things like that. And so a lot of folks think, oh, I'm giving points for calling my legislator or sending an email. But what you can actually do in addition to that is assign points for watching a video about your issue, reading an article, listening to a podcast. And so while certainly it takes work to create those resources or to identify which resources are the best, it then can drive folks to self-select to participate in them and seek them out because they want that recognition amongst their fellow employees, if you're a company running advocacy, or their fellow volunteers, and move up that ladder of gamification and of prizes and things. So that can at least make the push to get people to use the resources a little bit easier. Another resource that I saw recently that I think folks can use here is the Congressional Management Foundation has put out some advocacy training courses that organizations can use. So John, the resource that I referenced there was gamification through Quorum in our grassroots platform, where you can assign points to different actions to incentivize folks not only to do it the first time, but to come back again and again to your action center, to your resources. So that are some things that I see folks doing. And then finally, a question I feel like we always get is, what are some of those design tools or things that you can use to make things look nice, but not spend tons of money on a graphic designer, things like that. So we are big Canva fans over at Quorum. We use things like Unsplash for free imagery. These are a lot of things that finding those resources to make things look nice or polished can be difficult. So those are some things we use as well. And so finally, our last trend that we saw that contributes to this understaffing problem is some challenges in hiring. And what we saw was that folks are having trouble hiring some of those more junior team members who have the issue knowledge and relationships to really jump into the team. And so, Cicely, this is one of your areas of expertise. I'm wondering, first, I'd love to divide this into kind of two parts. One, from the team's perspective of like how they find the right people, and then also from the perspective of the candidate or the employee and how they can position themselves well. So let's start with, if you are a team who's having trouble filling a role because you can't find the perfect person, what are some maybe atypical skills that actually are well suited to public affairs, or what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, and I think you hit on it well as you were talking about really finding the issue or relationship experience. If you're looking for a junior person, you're rarely going to find both. So part of the skills, your question, Teresa, I think you've got to figure out which one is more important to you. If it's a junior person, now it's different if you're hiring senior person. That may be a different conversation regarding what level of experience they have. But for the skills for a junior person, it's initiative, so that you're not, we just talked about all the things that are going on that have to be managed. Initiative, no surprise, is big. I tend to call it intellectual curiosity. They've got to want to learn the bills, the strategies, the trends, the tools. They've got to want to be engaged in that kind of conversation. That is something, obviously, you can kind of gauge for in an interview, but it's also something that if you're hiring a junior person, the other skills I would say you want to look for, quite frankly, are they willing to shadow you, go to that state, build those relationships? Are they willing to go to the receptions and get out there? That again, if you're based, in a state, if you're in DC, a similar premise there, but junior staff, you want to, and look, I hear it all the time. They want growth. What does growth look like as well? And I heard this from somebody last week in our career community who's looking for a job. And he said to me, people just aren't leaving their roles. So even if I go somewhere, there's no growth. There's no opportunity. And that's a big part of the conversation now. We're past the pandemic. We're past the great reset and resignation. People are now looking to go somewhere and stay. The switching is not happening as often as we saw over the past couple of years, but if they don't think there's any growth for them, that's a big piece of the equation, whether it's a senior level person you're hiring or a junior level. So I'd start there with knowing what you're hiring for in terms of skills. You're not going to get experience in relationships, so which one of those are more important, but then also Teresa, to your point, what's number 2, 3, and 4 behind that you can hire for as well. And again, those are very different if it's a junior person versus a senior person.
Awesome. And Brian, wondering, as someone in the grassroots space, what are some of the skills that you look for someone who's looking to dive into grassroots advocacy and maybe comes from a different background than a traditional, I've worked in a program before?
Yeah, for one I will say that advocacy is a mentality. It's a sense of aggressiveness. It's a sense of liking the game and wanting to win, not sort of a win at all costs, but there is a game to politics, and grassroots plays into that. And you need to be able to think outside the Beltway. It's okay if your life was spent outside the Beltway, as long as you interact with people outside of it. That's what I like call real people, and you can think the way they think and write to what they want to hear. So those two things in particular, sort of that right mentality, wanting to win, wanting to run campaigns, thinking the right way. And then also you actually need to enjoy interacting with volunteers, members, and donors. So, because the way you're going to learn an organization the best is by having those interactions. And the way you're going to build out your program the best is by getting these folks to want to help you and want to help the mission. And so that's going to come from establishing really good relationships. And so, you can teach all the intricacies of the legislative process in Congress. But some of these other things I think are even more core to finding that right person, especially at that lower level, especially.
Yeah, great point.
And I guess because we've been talking especially a lot about state and teams building out new state functions, if a team gets one hire to expand their state efforts this year, what are the skills you think that person should have? Obviously, knowing that you can't solve for everything at once, what is kind of that first person that you want to build out that team?
Brian, I'll defer to you and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, but I think it's your person. I think it's your lobbyist, your connected person, because it takes more than one person to run grassroots without having an inside base. So I'd say to start with your folks.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say start with, whoever's going to lead that strategy, if that's your lobbyist, if that's your GR person, knowing, to Brian's point, you're going to build out the rest of it as you can, but starting with that person who can learn inside. So we've talked a lot about the legislative process, but don't forget, if you're new to a trade association, you got to learn the business of the industry. If you're in corporate, corporate's a whole different animal. You got to learn how corporate works and how, and because that's really what you're doing is you're connecting your internal to the, stakeholders who are the policymakers. So I think Brian's right. I think you've got to start with that person, but also understand that person can't just be external facing. You got to be able to connect internal to external, and that's the person you got to start with. Yeah.
Awesome. Now I'm going to jump back into our slides for a few moments and then we'll go to Q&A. So folks are welcome to start sharing their questions through the chat and everything there, but I'm going to jump through a little bit of how technology can help with some of these challenges in expanding the work that your team is able to do. So first, I want to talk very briefly about Quorum's professional services offerings. This is something new we've added in the last 12 months or so, so that if you are truly not able to add anything new to your team's plate, let us help take some of that off. whether that's data management of your stakeholders, helping build email campaigns, optimize your data management. We can do a lot of that. So please reach out to our team if there is a project or service that we can help you with, and take off your plate entirely. We've been talking lots about state and how to track the high volume of bills that are moving at a rapid pace, and Quorum's state product is our best bet to do that. So not only can you track the bills as they move through the legislatures, but also manage your engagement with those officials and staff, and organize your communications to those officials, and how your policy landscape is changing. Quorum's email tool Outbox is another great way to get more bang for your buck. So Outbox is really unique in that you can send those mass emails to every staffer who manages your issue, but make them feel personal. Use those tokens of their first name, their office legislator's name, the number of facilities that you have in their district, and send them all those personalized emails at once. So that way the time it takes you to write one email to one office can be duplicated to a whole list of folks there. You can also track engagement with your performance metrics like deliveries and opens. And this tool also has A/B testing. So you can try different subject lines or different button colors to see what gets more engagement. And while this might take a few extra minutes in the setup of the email, you can then use those results to make sure that your future emails are driving even greater impact, and that the time that you're spending writing an email actually gets read. Quorum offers a number of collaboration tools that helps your team work together better, which we know can help efficiency as you pass messaging from federal to state folks, you share information from state to state, or between your grassroots and your lobbying teams. So things like sharing notes, tagging your team members, assigning them to different bills and issues can all help you manage your workflows in Quorum. And then finally, reporting and visualizations. While we all talked about how our team sizes aren't changing and budgets are where they are, Quorum also offers the tools where you can make the case to your leadership that you should get that extra staffer. So this here is a visualization of Quorum's Sheets tool to track the number of facilities, the number of bills you're having an impact on, the number of meetings you're having. And then we also have a dashboard functionality that Cicely talked about, where again, you can show different visualizations of the number of engagements that you're having and the impact of your team's work so that you can then share those off with your executive team. So thank you for listening to my product spiel. And now if anyone has questions, please send them in.
Hey, Teresa, one point I might make, we're waiting for questions if you don't
Absolutely.
mind. And I think Brian hit on it and you hit on it well. The one thing we were talking about the individual piece of GR folks looking for different roles, and I usually get some of these questions after this Quorum webinars. But the one thing that we miss is GR folks, grassroots folks, advocacy teams. Is we don't know how to market ourselves. We don't know how to. I call it monetizing your authority. We have such unique backgrounds in what we do, how we live at the intersection of so many different worlds. But we don't know how to market that. We don't know how to put ourselves out there. And listen, your HR team doesn't know that either. They don't know what they're looking for because our world is so unique. So if you're a team hiring, but more importantly, if you're an individual looking to make a move, you got to learn how to market yourself as a grassroots advocacy GR lobbyist, because there's power in a skill set that you have for sure.
I'll jump in real quickly while I know Teresa's answering a Q&A question.
Yes,
just from what you said, I'm just going to put in a special plug for that A/B testing. It takes a minute, literally, to run an A/B test. And so any message you send out where your universe is big enough, whether it's volunteers, members, donors, lawmakers, staff, whenever you can A/B test, you should definitely do it, because you're going to continue to learn and continue to optimize your messages and your actions.
Yeah, absolutely. The smallest things can make an impact there, from the way you write your subject lines to where you place your buttons, or whether it's a designed email versus a plain text email. And so making those small switches really has an impact down the line.
Great point.
We are still waiting on some questions, but I will ask one here. Brian, I'll direct this to you. How can teams get more from their advocacy by working with their lobbying teams? What are the ways that you see grassroots teams sharing their impact internally to use those stories and things on the other side of the equation?
Yeah, look, you got to become best friends with your lobbying team. The grassroots folks and lobbyist folks, they live in different worlds. They talk to different people, but it's really important to have that relationship, because there's a number of things to answer your question that they can do. One is they can help you identify opportunities for engagement. So if you have an issue, if you ran a big campaign last year and you brought a lot of volunteers in around that campaign, then you need to activate those people again, ideally on a similar issue. And maybe it's not a priority agenda issue for you this year, but you can reach out to your lobbyists and say, okay, look, is it okay if we sort of push for this, even though I know it's not going to get too far legislatively? So that's one thing to help identify opportunities. The second thing is sort of creating what I sort of consider to be micro campaigns and sort of having to manufacture moments. We all know, especially at the congressional level, the process is very slow. So you can't just ask your volunteers to take action in March, or your donors and members to say, well, we'll get back to them again in August when this thing actually moves. And so I'd always work with our lobbyists, say, okay, can we manufacture things? Can we do a co-sponsor drive with a deadline of this date so that we can then celebrate reaching that goal? And what are some things we can do along the way to really bring our volunteers down a very deliberate path toward our ultimate goal? Because what you can't do as a grassroots person is rely solely on the legislative calendar to run your campaign. It'll be too haphazard. Your volunteers won't be there by the time you actually truly need them for a legislative purpose if you only are going by their program.
That's a great tip, because so many bills, like, things get pushed into appropriations and passed all at once. And you can't, like, if you're reaching out only at the time when everyone is reaching out because things are moving, you're going to run into those. I like that strategy a lot, of those sponsor increased campaigns within a short period of time. I'm going to steal that as an idea. We do have a couple questions that came in. What advice do you have for small organizations that are a team of one doing the government affairs, PR, and advocacy engagement work if they had to prioritize their time and efforts?
I have been a team of one. When I worked on the corporate side, I was a team of one for many, many years doing federal, state, local, and international. So I get the pain point of that question, but also what I would say kind of goes back to the conversation we're having here, and Teresa said prioritization. It would help you on the front end if you put together your strategy, so you're not putting it together as you go. And this is something you should train my teams on when I went to a bigger organization, was when an issue pops up, go ahead and put your strategy together. What is the lobbying component, the grassroots component, the PR component, the engagement component? Have it all laid out. So if you need to present it to your boss or your executive team, you do it once, and then you're just executing versus putting it together as you go, because that is a little bit of the time-consuming pieces we were just talking about. So I think the biggest thing you can do is prioritize, but then put strategy around that prioritization as a one-person shop, or kind of two of the places I would suggest that you start.
Awesome. And then I love this next question, especially since we know that policy over the last several years, companies in particular, but just overall, that a company's policy stance is bleeding into its external comms in general. It's no longer kind of separate. And so this person asks, how much should I bug my comms person to help with my lobbying work?
Brian, you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
I love when the issue goes over to the outside from a grassroots perspective, because now all of a sudden it's gone mainstream, it's got relevance, it's getting coverage. People are talking about it, and that means my emails are going to drive a lot more action, my text messages, a lot more action than they want to. And so, I guess it depends on each organization. Anywhere I've worked, people I work with, most stuff has to run through the comm shop anyway. And so we talked earlier about building that relationship with your lobbyists. Having that relationship with your comm shop is equally as important. We used to sort of have an understanding at one place I worked where I was allowed to do a little bit more hyperbole in my writing than some other folks were, than maybe the lobbyists could or the policy people could, because we proved to them why. And we actually did a little bit A/B testing to show, here's your version of it, here's my version. Watch how much bigger reaction my version gets. And so, yeah, I would definitely look to partner with them. And what you want to try to do, if you can, it's a bit of a stretch, but infuse in those talking points that the comms team is using and folks are using to let them know about the advocacy work that's going on. Drive people to your website and work with your web development folks in that comm shop to maybe put something on the homepage or a little higher profile on that website to help bring in more advocacy volunteers and bring more folks into this issue. So I would, for one, hopefully you've already built that really great relationship with your comms person. And so now when you go to bug them, which you definitely should do, they're ready for you.
Yeah.
The other thing I think about here is many comms teams are talking about their employer footprint, their work in the community for non-lobbying reasons, just for general brand building, because people, consumers are looking for companies that have a positive community impact. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We see a lot of organizations sending emails to Capitol Hill that are focused on, look at the great work I'm doing in your community, so that there isn't an immediate ask, but then down the line when they have an ask, that's reminded of. And that's actually validated by the survey, which showed a big focus for people this year is building their brand on Capitol Hill and in state houses. So if the comms team is already writing these like community goods pieces, or they're working in PR on new facilities that are opening, you should absolutely reuse a lot of that content for sharing with those key Capitol Hill stakeholders or state house stakeholders.
That's a great point. I would just add on to the two of you. I'm going to get tactical for a second. Don't bug them. Have a weekly one-on-one or standing bi-weekly if you can. What you want to do is integrate your strategy. So it's not episodic of, oh, I have an issue, I need to talk to comms. It's how do you then start to integrate comms and, all the things that Brian and Teresa said as well. Integration is going to be key there. So share your strategy, let them share theirs, hopefully at the beginning of the year, so that your strategies, then you have a roadmap of how you guys are going to work together. But yeah, make that a routine touch point every couple of weeks. Just have it on the calendar. So then you actually have time to actually force that integration, hopefully not force, but to have that conversation. So now it becomes, you really want to be involved in them. They want you involved in their work, and you don't feel like you're bugging them all the time. So that would be my suggestion in addition to what Brian and Teresa said.
I'm also just going to give a quick plug. Quorum does offer a communications tool. That's one of the newer additions to our suite. And so teams could actually be working in the same platform that works together. So your comms person can tag you in the news articles that they want to highlight, and you can see that same article, share it with your team, along with a number of other collaboration tools if you're using that same interface that all works together. And then final question before we wrap up. What metrics do you recommend to show success for a government affairs department to internal organization stakeholders to demonstrate that it's worth increasing investment in the department?
That's a whole webinar.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot. Brian, do you want to jump in? Because man, there's like 10 things. I don't know, not 10.
Go ahead, hit your things and I'll see what's left.
The biggest thing I do for ROI, right? How to prove ROI, especially even if you're in a trade association or corporate or wherever you are, I love to show monetary impact of the work I do. So I love to connect the ROI back to, did I save the company money? Because so often what we do is preventing something from happening. We'll show the impact of what would have been the impact to the company had you not stopped that bill. Sometimes I hear from so many folks, why I don't know how to show impact. I don't know how to measure it. You can measure what we do in a lot of tangible ways, and starting with impact, both monetary, but also the impact of your work is the biggest one I've always led with, improving, regardless of what the organization was, proving the value of government affairs. The second thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Brian for time's sake, is treat your work as a shared resource internally. Here's what I mean by that. Even though I was a one-person shop in a public company, I met with the executives and the marketing team, the product team, the CFO, the ops team. I integrated myself with every single part of the organization. So not only did I know what the business was, but I helped them see the value of what I did, how it connected back to them achieving their goals every year. I did that in the trade association world as well, connecting those dots and painting that picture of, here's how I can help you, in treating government affairs as a shared resource amongst the company or the association or your member companies is a huge value add that they don't always connect the dots on. But Brian, I'll turn it over to you for time's sake.
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I love the way you framed all that. And so two quick, very direct answers. One is we look at engagement. not opens, not clicks, not how many emails you sent, but actually what kind of engagement you got. The second thing is, I'll tell you from the nonprofit perspective, every place I've worked or I've consulted for, volunteers who engage in advocacy had higher lifetime giving or higher donation scoring, depending on how your organization scores people for potential donations. And so being able to tie advocacy directly to donations, of course, also toward the mission goals, that's going to help you get that additional funding and additional staff people you need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for our time today. We have taken almost a full hour here. So thank you so much to Brian and Cicely.